your source for everything paranormal. Para-X. The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para-X, its affiliates, or its sponsors.
May the circle be open but unbroken. May the peace of the goddess be ever in your heart. Merry meet and merry part, and merry meet again. May the circle be open but unbroken. May the peace of the goddess be ever in your heart. Merry meet and merry part, and merry meet again.
Welcome to Stirring the Cauldron on the Para-X Radio Network. And now, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
Hey, merry meet everybody, and welcome to Stirring the Cauldron. Tonight we're going to explore American Brujeria with my guest, J. Allen Cross. Now, Jay is a practicing witch of Mexican, Native American, and European descent whose craft was shaped by his Catholic upbringing and mixed family culture. Living in his home state of Oregon, he works as a psychic medium and an occult specialist for a well-known paranormal investigation team out of Portland, the Portland metro area. When he's not investigating, he enjoys providing spells and potions to his local community, exploring haunted and abandoned places, working as a consultant for other workers and investigators, and, of course, writing about witchcraft. His newly released book, American Brujeria, is about the fascinating blend of American and Mexican folk magic, and is currently used by those people living in the United States, but whose roots are steeped in Mexican culture. Now, any questions or comments are welcome, as always, from those in the chat room. So if you have something to say or ask and you aren't here, come over to the paraxnetwork.com and pop into the chat room. So we've got a whole lot of ground to cover. So, Jay Allen, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me on.
I love the book. So it's like, sorry, over the years, I've had guests from all realms of folk magic, like Southern Conjure, so some of these people anyway, Italian folk magic, backwoods witchcraft, old style conjure, voodoo, hoodoo, and all that stuff. And I was really happy to come across your book, because you don't see too many books on Brujeria. And so what was your incentive for writing it?
I really wanted to do something that would connect people back to their culture. And, several people had asked me to write a book on Brujeria. And the issue is that I don't know, traditional Mexican Brujeria, because it's very different than kind of what we're talking about in the book. But as people were asking me about that, I began to look around and realize that the people who were like me, people who are both Mexican and American, have kind of developed their own style of doing this work. And it's kind of made up of several different paths of magic that are, found in Mexico, but then they're all brought over to the United States where they get kind of put into a big pile that we sort of work from. And knowing that that was sort of unique to us in our experience and kind of our culture in the world, I really wanted to kind of showcase that. And it gave me a way as well to not only talk about folk magic, but also to communicate directly with people who are like me, who are both kind of Mexican ancestry, but, living in the United States. So it gave me a good way to sort of round up my people and kind of have a chat with them.
Yeah, well, that's really important, because a lot of people come from mixed backgrounds, and so you're kind of walking the tightrope, one side doesn't accept you and the other side doesn't either, because you're right in the middle, and they say, well, you're that. No, you're that, and so you can't win. So, I've got that in my family. So it's like, okay, all right, I'm just me then, don't label me. I'm just me. Exactly. All right. So, you know what, we're talking about Brujeria, and Here in Los Angeles, I mean, we're rich in Mexican culture, which, includes lots of shops that sell supplies, and there are probably those, though, listening in that might not be familiar with the term brujeria. So can you explain, for those who might not know, what we're talking about?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So there's kind of two different brujerias that we're seeing in the world. We have the kind of Latin American style, so brujeria is found in pretty much all Latin American countries and Spain. And it's something that's going to be a little bit different based on the countries, but it kind of tends to overlap very well among them. It tends to be pretty consistent. But brujeria in these Latin American countries is a very sort of scary type of magic. It's very dark. It's very forceful magic that a lot of people don't get to learn how to do because it's kept very secret. And that's kind of the traditional sort of brujeria that you would be talking about, say, if you were in one of these countries, or if you were talking to a person who is from one of those countries. Mm-hmm. However, in the United States, we tend to treat words like witchcraft, which is kind of the direct translation of brujeria, as an umbrella term for all kinds of spiritual activities, whether it's astrology or Wicca or energy healing, things like that. All of this kind of gets lumped under the category of witchcraft. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we don't really find as much in other countries. But when immigrants came to the United States, they brought with them bits and pieces of all of their magical past. So over in Mexico, for instance, we have brujeria, but we also have curanderismo, we have magia, we have hechiceria, we have all kinds of different types of magic, mm-hmm. and those are then further subcategorized. But these things are brought over to the United States by immigrants and then kind of passed down to their descendants, which is us, which are Mexican-American people living here in the United States. And that means that what we're being taught is kind of a mashup of a bunch of different things. And then the rules on top of it also change a little bit as well. So when we are in a place like Mexico and we need spiritual healing, we would go to a curandero, which is mm-hmm. a spiritual folk healer. Mm-hmm. But in the States, we do have curanderos and curanderas, but they are very few and far between, at least the legitimate ones are, which mm-hmm. means that people who were immigrating to the United States really had to take this work into their own hands and not have to rely on the curanderos or the brujas or the hechiceros anymore, and had to take it into their own hands. So that's why we don't really see people in the United States necessarily going to a curandera, but instead going to a tia or someone's mom or, mm-hmm. someone's uncle or something like that in order to get this work done. So when we talk about American brujeria, we're talking about this sort of collection of Mexican magic that has been brought over by immigrants. And the reason why we still call it brujeria, even though it's not the same thing as it is in the Latin American countries, is simply kind of just our common vernacular right now. You ask, Latinx youth, what is this called, this magic that you're doing, these novena candles to Guadalupe, what do you call this? And they'll tell you brujeria. Mm-hmm. And it's partially simply because in the United States we tend to use words like that as giant umbrellas. But also at the same time, too, it's almost a little bit like a joke. Because it sounds very spooky. We as children were always kind of warned about the brujeria and, don't mess with brujas and things like that. So it's a bit of kind of a tongue-in-cheek sort of reclaiming this kind of very scary word in the United States to mean something very, very welcoming and very supportive to reclaiming culture.
Yeah, like you call your kid when she's acting up, a bruja, for example. It's just what you do. And, it is a good umbrella term, but it is the most familiar term. But, I was talking to someone the other day who saw the banner for the show, and she commented that from what little she knows about brujeria in general, it sounds like a tradition close to voodoo because some of the Catholic saints are worshipped. And you say in the book that it's also very close to conjure traditions of the American South as well. So do you think that all folk magic is kind of put together in bits and pieces from several traditions, like, picking the best of both worlds?
Yeah, that's very common. And it's also very common, for us to trade amongst each other. Because whenever we're talking about folk magic, we're not talking about, set, types of magic like the Golden Dawn or whatever it is. Folk magic just simply means the magic that the people are doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, people are trading and learning from one another, from our neighbors, and especially in a place like the United States where we have so many different cultures kind of converging, there's going to be a lot of trade happening there. And yeah, so these practices definitely do overlap.
Yeah, and even in American witchcraft, I hate labels in general. I mean, witch you have to take, but some people are Straga, some people are Wiccan, some people are all this stuff, mm-hmm. and some people are eclectic witches. And I think all of us, even though we claim to be something, if we have to claim to be something, I still think we're all kind of eclectic, and we pick and choose from other people's cultures to make it work for us, because as there's no right or wrong way to do witchcraft, no matter what country it's from. It comes from the soul, your own soul, and your own experiences and stuff. So I think it's the eclecticism. Oh, I think I just made a word up. But I think, we hear what other people talk about. We hear what other people do. And sometimes it's like it rings a bell. And it may not be what you were taught or whatever, but all of a sudden it felt comfortable for you. And you grab it and you work with it. And it works very well, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, okay, so we're talking about some of the same Catholic saints and stuff. So let's talk a little bit about the relationship between Catholicism and Brujeria.
Absolutely. So when we go into old country Brujeria, it's not so much the same thing. A lot of times people confuse Brujeria with a sort of folk Catholicism that we see, where we're lighting novenas to saints and praying the rosary to Guadalupe and things like that. But that's mm-hmm. actually closer to something that we would call hechicería, which is like sorcery or spellcasting. Uh-huh. But the issue is that one is much less known. The word hechicería is much less known, and it's harder to say. So I think people really kind of avoid it a lot of times. But in this work that we're calling, American Brujeria, where it's kind of all of these practices kind of piled into one, the saints play a huge role in it, because the bulk of this work is spirit work and creating relationships with spirit allies on the other side who can then help us in our daily lives. Mm-hmm. Where people get really confused is that they think that the saints are, it's like Santeria, where the saints are a disguise for some other spirit. Mm-hmm. But in our world, they are the actual Catholic saints, and people have a hard time kind of wrapping their brain around that. But as someone who grew up Catholic and in kind of a magical family, they really overlap very well, because, mm-hmm. I grew up in a Catholic church where we would light a candle and ask for something. And then mm-hmm. after I ran away from Catholicism and went over to witchcraft, people are lighting candles and asking for something. We're not as far apart as people tend to think. So the two worlds definitely overlap. It's just kind of our method of going about it, essentially.
Yeah. There's a question from the chat room. Would you call the mix of, eclectic picking and choosing the old ways or ancient traditions, or just, something that we put together now?
Definitely, I wouldn't necessarily call it the old ways, because it's our new system of kind of picking and choosing from stuff isn't necessarily then it gets kind of diluted with other things and changes. So I definitely wouldn't call that the old ways or kind of the way that they did it or anything like that. This mm-hmm. is fairly modern. And that's why I definitely wanted to put the word modern kind of on the cover of the book and everything, because it's something that we're seeing now. These traditions are very much living and breathing, so they are very much alive and well. It's not something from a bygone era so much. Right.
All right, another chat room question. She says, so there's a difference between sorcery, witchcraft, and spellcasting?
Yep. That's something that really throws people off a lot. So there's, but it's very similar to how we have things like, we have Wicca, and then we have, traditional witchcraft, and then we have ceremonial magic. These are all magic, but they're all very different from one another. I would not say that, Wicca and hoodoo are the same thing because they're both magic. They're very different. And so when we go to kind of the Mexican forms of magic, we have things like curanderismo, which is a healing art. It's very much based around not only spiritual health and, getting rid of things like, hexes and the evil eye and whatnot, or evil spirits, but it's also about healing. And it's often, not only spiritual healing, but mental healing as well, and physical healing. Curanderos also, in a lot of places, serve the same function as doctors, because in certain areas of South America and Central America, there are certain places where a doctor or a hospital couldn't be found for 20, 30 miles. So curanderos would be the ones who would step in and take care of that. So there's even different kinds of curanderos. We have ones who work with plants, ones who work with, massage and hands-on healing. There's even like hueseros and hueseras, which are kind of like bone healers. So if you broke a bone, they would set it and cast it and be able to facilitate the healing of bones, things like that. So there's so many different types of healing underneath that umbrella itself. But it's all kind of has the same sort of background and methodology to it, versus then we have something like brujeria. And brujeria, traditionally in these areas, it's very dark, and it does kind of require some not so fun things with animals. A lot of the work that we see that actually kind of gets out is things like, you take a toad and you put someone's name inside of it, and then and this is a live toad, that you stuff somebody's name inside of it, and then you sew all of its holes closed, and then boil it in a pot or something like that. So it's a very kind of dark, you have to really, really mean it if you're going to be doing the brujeria. And hechiceria is sort of in the middle. It's where we kind of find this novenas to saints. We also find things called amares, which are love spells. But we also find this in brujeria. There is some overlap between them, but they are kind of worked with as distinct, different areas.
Yeah, and I mean, it's confusing even in regular language. I mean, somebody says, well, the thing about spellcasting. Well, all spellcasters are witches, but not all witches cast spells, and that kind of makes people go, what? But it is. I mean, it's all different. Now, I know with some of the saints that are worshipped, I mean, like Santa Muerte, for example, that's a pretty dark spell to work with. I mean, a saint to work with. But you can kind of pick and choose. I mean, again, I think when we start doing the craft in whatever way, we do what's comfortable. We just kind of gravitate to that. And, I don't think that, when people say, well, I'm a white witch, I never hurt anybody. Human beings cross the line sometimes, I mean, if and I've used this before, if your child, if your husband, if your wife was in terrible danger and you had to do something very rash and ugly to save them, are you going to say, well, I'm a white witch and I won't do anything bad? I mean, there are times that we cross lines. So I think that's why I hate labels, but I think we all practice in a different way. I mean, if you get 10 witches in a room and ask them how to do a particular spell, you're going to get the spell 10 different ways. And neither of those are right or wrong. It's from who is doing the spell casting kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, it's very confusing. Sorcery sounds very mysterious. Witchcraft is a term everybody knows. Spell casting gets people like, ooh, spells. So yeah, it's an umbrella term. I mean, they're all kind of umbrella terms in one way or the other, but it's really kind of interesting how we all get together and bond together and manage to do what we do and get it right. I found it interesting talking about Catholicism and the church in reading your book that, like most of us, charge our tools, our wands, our stones, our crystals, whatever, by the light of a full moon. But it was interesting to read in the book that some people take items into church and have them charged. Now, how does that work? Because I think if any of us walked into, a regular American Catholic church and said, here, we need to charge these witchcraft tools, we'd probably get kicked out or cursed out or something. So what goes on in the churches that people can get their things charged?
So a great deal of what we do in this work definitely falls under the heading of Catholicism. And Catholicism is very magical innately. I mean, the entire ritual of Mass is all but a high ceremonial situation that we're doing. The thing is that our people, we simply lean into the magical aspect and keep leaning into it until we are eventually kind of back to back with witchcraft. And then we pretend like we're very different, but we're not. But there's a whole chapter in the book on working in the church or having things charged in the church, which is kind of a traditional thing that would happen back in the day. So like curanderas would take their plants to church. There's a very well-known curandera named Maria Sabina who worked a lot with psychedelic mushrooms, and she would take them to the church and have them blessed before using them in her ceremonies. We have to remember that the Catholic Church, though with its awful bloody history, is an integral part of Mexican culture, that we really can't remove it from anything just because it's so ingrained in everything that we do. But this is very common to bring things to church and have them blessed. And if you look through the Catholic Roman ritual, I have it in 3 full volumes here with me. There's an entire volume on blessing, and there's blessing for herbs, there's blessings for candles, there's blessings for altars, for special tools. There's blessings for everything, and even including like protective metals and all kinds of stuff. So we work a great deal of magic, staying within the bounds of Catholicism. And in this chapter, I wanted to sort of talk about this idea of working magic in the church, but something I really try to drive home is the fact that everything that we do in the church should be kind of in line with Catholic stuff. So I'm not saying to go in there with an athame and cast a circle in the church and do your spell. I think that would be awful. Please. But things like just simply putting a novena in the novena rack and lighting it and asking a saint to help you, going into a church to do that is very powerful, because we're taking our wants and our needs into God's house and then, lighting a candle to get their attention and then asking for things. And that's a very powerful thing. And it's something that we do and see a lot in Mexican culture, is just people going into the church to light candles and ask for everything to be okay, essentially.
Yeah, no, that's easy. I mean, I would, when you're doing something like that, you're not showing what you're doing or why you're doing it or how you're doing, because it's kind of a personal thing when you're lighting a candle and asking for blessings. But if, for example, you walked in and you had this real large pentagram right around your neck, I think, you might not be too welcome there. So I would yeah. I think I would not try to bless my pentagram in there, because people see it on me anyway, and they kind of take 2 steps back, and it's not very big, but it's like, oh, okay, all right. So a little while ago, you were talking about the family and the traditions, that you were raised in a family that was much into the occult. Did they practice brujeria? Or, because it's kind of, I think it's kind of like a second nature, when you grow up knowing about that and stuff. I think it's part of you, like in Southern Conjure, you don't think that you're practicing witchcraft or something. This is something that's everyday life. So is that kind of your family, some of the superstitions or, whatever, you just kind of grew up with it rather than seeking it?
I had always thought that I had grown up very, very normal until I was asked by someone to write down my story of being a witch. And then I realized once I had to condense it all into about 3 pages how weird the upbringing was, because I didn't really grow up in a family where they necessarily called themselves witches or practiced something that was a specific type of work. It was just kind of how we lived. So I grew up with a mother who would read tarot cards for her friends at our dining room table. You know, she would light candles. Her friend would come over and she would read their cards for them. I remember, you know, blue candles full of black glass to get rid of one of my mom's nasty bosses. All of a family, too, kind of innately, even though they don't necessarily, you know, practice a specific thing, they're very innately magical. So what I mean by that is my mother was adopted, and when we found her birth family when I was really young, everything was fine. You know, we had the normal conversations like, you know, oh, do you have the family ears? Do you have blah, 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 blah? But after they kind of got comfortable with us, one at a time, they started kind of coming forth and going, so does anything weird happen with you guys? And we're like, well, what do you mean? And they're like, you know, like, do you ever get angry and like a light bulb bursts, or you wish for like it happens? And we're like, oh yeah, no, that definitely happens. They're like, okay, that's a family thing too. We all do it. And a lot of them too are very psychic. So I got the kind of the psychic medium thing. My mother speaks to animals, and my grandmother was a visionary. She was a devoutly religious woman, and she would go to temple and she would pray, and then she would receive a vision from who she called her Heavenly Father, God. And that's how she would give us our Native American names, by these visions. We're heavily Native American in my family. We come from Puebloan people. But that was kind of my grandmother's process for that. And she would talk a lot about how the Heavenly Father would speak to her. And so we'd be driving somewhere, and she'd just be like, the Heavenly Father is telling me to change lanes. And she'd just like go across like three lanes of traffic. And come to realize that, you know, there was a reason for it. Like, you know, there was a car wreck, right, where we, you know, had just been, or there was a purpose behind it. And so even though we didn't necessarily call ourselves, you know, witches and things like that, or wear pentagrams, we were all very magical. And that was something that I had to kind of deal with being a part of growing up. And what led me to witchcraft was trying to deal with what was just kind of innately coming out of me and my whole family.
Yeah, it was who you were. I mean, my family was kind of the same way. So how old were you when you started actually practicing the craft and saying, you know, hey, I'm a witch, I'm going to, you know, get into it?
Really, really young. I probably purchased my first actual like book of spells when I was like 11, but it started before that. I was that kid where, like, you know, in the summer, it was before I could read and write, because all my friends were doing things like, you know, mowing people's lawns and doing like lemonade stands and stuff in the summer. And I wanted to go out and do something too. So I asked my parents how to spell exorcist, because that's what I wanted to offer the local neighborhood by putting up flyers around. The look on my father's face was priceless. But so it was something that kind of came on very early. And shortly kind of after that period, my parents signed me up for T-ball because my older sister had done it and loved it. Turns out I'm not good at baseball at all. So I found out that if I could make it rain, I wouldn't have to go and play baseball. So I routinely made it rain so that I wouldn't have to play.
Good thinking. Yeah. I mean, it's funny how we all get into it and move into it. And you know, I think all of us, or most of us anyway, know from an early age. Some people are late bloomers, though. But like I said, if it's in the family, it's just with you. I mean, my mother saw dead people. And, you know, and I mean, it was nothing. So, yeah, it's kind of neat. Well, we are going to take a quick break. So everybody sit back. Go get something to drink if you need to, and we'll be back in 2 minutos.
Don't go away. There's more Stirring the Cauldron with Marla Brooks right after these important messages.
Ramirez with Cat Paranormal of Minnesota.
Hi, I'm Willow Lehman Shine, Psychic Medium, Dark Nola Paranormal, New Orleans.
And I'm Jerry Ayers with Supernatural Investigators of Minnesota, and together we are The Calling. Every Wednesday night, 7 p.m. Central Standard Time and 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, only on ParaXRadioNetwork.com.
Hi, this is Marla Brooks from Stirring the Cauldron. Thursdays are a great night on the ParaX Radio Network. On the first and third Thursdays of the month at 8 p.m., it's Tango and Friends, hosted by Bruce Tango. And on the alternate Thursdays at 8 p.m., tune in to Stirring the Cauldron, the Archive podcast. Every week at 9 p.m. Eastern, join me on Stirring the Cauldron Live. And then at 10 p.m., stick around for New Aeon Now with Lily Alley, Davron Michaels, and Christine Matza. Finally, to round out the night, join Dr. Kelly Renee Schutz on the Paranormal Encounters podcast. All this every Thursday, right here on ParaX.
Missed an episode of Stirring the Cauldron? Then be sure to check out marlabrooks.com and check out the archive. And while you're there, check out Marla's weekly Witches Oracle card reading. Explore the site to find many great resources, such as information on tarot, oracle readings, metaphysical consultations, and links to all of Marla's books. That's marlabrooks.com. Welcome back to Stirring the Cauldron. Once again, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
All right. Now, J. Allen Cross is my guest tonight, and we're talking about his book, American Brujeria. And before we jump back in, I've got another question from the chat room, Jay. She wants to know, are sugar skulls associated with brujeria, and why do they call them sugar skulls?
Yeah. So they're definitely associated with Mexican culture. I'm not sure I would say specifically with brujeria, but they are associated with Mexican culture. And we call them sugar skulls because they're often made out of sugar, especially the real authentic ones that you can get in Mexico. They're made out of sugar because they're but back in the day, historically, they would use actual skulls. But that's, as we get into modern time, people are a little less okay with that. And so we use those around Day of the Dead to represent our ancestors, kind of in place of getting out their actual skulls and putting them on a table. We kind of use it as a representation, and it's a little less scary once it's in sugar at that point.
Some of them are beautiful, and you just have to keep them out of the rain, right? Right. So your book includes spellcasting, oil crafting, candle magic making, protective charms, so much more. And there are also stories and folklore on the lives of Mexican saints and folk figures. Now, one of the saints that you've talked about tonight is Guadalupe. And it's kind of like I hear the story, but I don't exactly know what's going on because, all right, I'm going to admit something that I'll never say again, but I kind of got hooked on Mexican novellas, which is really kind of amusing because when my friend Ginny and I were growing up, we used to laugh at her abuela because her grandmother would sit there religiously smoking Del Prado cigarettes every day and watching her novellas, and we vowed that we would never grow up to do that. So, don't ever say never, but that's besides the point. But once or twice watching Univision here and there, I've watched La Rosa de Guadalupe. It came up. It's a novella. And I'd like to hear the story of the rose that magically appears when someone has prayed to her for help.
Well, roses, I'm not sure about the specific stories, but roses are very heavily associated with Guadalupe because of kind of her origin story and kind of the miracle of the roses that happened. But it's very common for people who do work with her, who sometimes call themselves Guadalupanos or Guadalupanas, to receive signs through roses, just simply because they're such a symbol for her. So it's not uncommon for people to pray to her and then have their rose bush just absolutely bloom, or put out some kind of like rose buds on her altar and then have them just open beautifully, the next morning, or things like that. It tends to really kind of communicate through roses, or when people are working with her, sometimes the room will fill with the scent of roses. And that's kind of one of her beautiful is to let people know that she is around.
Okay, so also they refer to her as the Virgin, and are people saying that she might be the Virgin Mother, the Blessed Mother, or I get kind of confused with that.
It does take a little bit of unpacking because she's kind of both. She is, and now of course someone's going to write hate mail as soon as I say this. She is a form of Mary because I mean just look at her. I mean clearly that this is the end of me. However, kind of the underside that a lot of people aren't aware of is that someone who looked just like her had already been appearing in Mexico for quite some time. And there's all these stories about a Aztec, or not an Aztec, I don't think, I'm not sure, but an indigenous goddess known as Tonantzin, who is kind of the Mother Earth, kind of all-mother sort of figure from that type of spirituality. And right on the spot, so if we go back to the story of Guadalupe, when Juan Diego sees the apparition and she's like, I want a shrine built to me right here. That location that she designates was the original area where a shrine to Tonantzin, this Earth Mother Goddess, had been built. And so there's this weird overlap where like it is Tonantzin, but she's sort of showing up in a Marian form, because that is something that kind of the New World Order that the Spanish are bringing in would allow them to keep. And so there's a lot of overlap between sort of indigenous spirituality and Catholicism that happens within the spirit of Guadalupe. That requires a little bit of understanding, but you have to understand that she is both. A lot of people will be very vehement that no, she is Mary, or no, she is Tonantzin, and there's no overlap at all, but really her image and her kind of veneration is definitely seen as being both. And even like the image of her that we still have surviving to this day, it's said that depending on which side of the room that you view it on one side of the room she'll look very indigenous, and on the other side of the room she'll look very European. And so it's very much this idea of that she is both wrapped into one.
Okay. Yeah, because, I mean, I'm watching these things, and it's just not making sense. And then they had a big celebration, like a holy day for the Saint Guadalupe. And it was really a big deal. I mean, it was huge. So, yeah, I was just kind of like, okay, I'm not quite getting it, but I'm working on it. So thank you for explaining. And as you know, I told you earlier, we're going to be jumping kind of back and forth from things in the book because time goes by really fast. But one thing that caught my eye was your section on herbs and plants that are commonly used. And one of them is Santa Muerte, or the ghost chaser plant. Do you know what the English name for it is? And, tell us a little bit about it. And have you used it in any of your paranormal investigations?
So in English, sometimes it's referred to as a false daisy plant, or sometimes called a tattoo plant. But it doesn't really grow so much in the United States. The only place that I was able to find it, I had to get it air-mailed into me, and it was fresh. So by the time it got to me, it was like withered. Not much there. So I don't tend to work with it too much. It's an excellent plant. It's really powerful. It will chase away, ghosts. It will also break, all these different hexes and curses and stuff like that. But I'm very much into kind of working with what is around. And that's a lot of what this work kind of is based on is what you have access to normally. So I find that honestly, for getting rid of ghosts, salt works just fine, and for getting rid of the hexes and things, we all rue is much easier to come by. So
yeah,
I don't think it's too much.
It just and because I was reading, it does all these different things. I mean, it can be used as a floor wash to get rid of a house that's haunted. It could be used in the bath to remove an evil spirit. But if it's hard to get, it's hard to get. I guess if people knew about it and it was readily available, investigators would probably take it on investigations as some sort of protection, don't you think?
Yeah, I think it kind of depends on the investigator as well. Sometimes
sure.
Investigation teams that are not at all superstitious or into any of that, but sometimes I think people might.
Yeah, well, you got to mix both worlds, I think, on investigations. It's pretty cool to do that, have both sides of the coin, because if you open your eyes and instead of looking in the black and white and you look in the gray area, you find a lot of really neat stuff there. Yeah. All right, so there's also a chapter in the book on practicing the art of limpias, which I think is really important in all forms of the craft. So can you explain what limpias are, and perhaps give an example of how to combat mal de ojo, the evil eye?
Certainly. So a limpia is a kind of just a broad term for a cleansing, generally a spiritual cleansing. And normally a curandero or a curandera would be someone who would administer this. However, in the United States, it's normally like your mom or your grandma or somebody doing it. But there's all manner of things that can be done in a limpia. A lot of times people think that there's a very specific protocol that is always followed, A, B, C, D, when doing a limpia. But it's actually it's very adaptable. So depending on what you go in for, what is going on with you, your limpia will be different. They might smoke you down with incense, or they might rub you down with an object like an egg or a candle or something like an onion even. Might be that they do. They also might put you in a bathtub and pour a bunch of stuff over you. So you really never know how it's going to go. But it's essentially just a process of getting rid of, negativity, the energy of illness. We also have a lot of different kind of malefic energies that we think about in Mexican culture. So we have things called envidias, which is like envy. You also have stuff that's caused by gossip or people talking about you. And then we have, of course, the ojo, or, the evil eye. A lot of times in this world, prevention is key. So people will wear things like red bracelets or red kind of accessories to deflect the evil eye, because red is very protective. It kind of repels evil. So it's very common to find red things. But if you actually, find out that you have the evil eye on you, which it's pretty simple to tell. A lot of the times people will come down with some sort of an illness or a lot of bad luck, and then you go and you get, a limpia. And you can take this off in all kinds of ways. So we can work with a plant like ruda, which is commonly known as rue. Rue has a very special affinity for the evil eye, so you would do something called a barida, which is a sweep using like a bundle of rue. They would sweep you down from head to toe to kind of clear it. Or we could do something called a limpia con huevo, which is an egg cleansing, where you take the regular chicken egg and you would kind of rub the person down from the top of their head all the way down to their feet as a method of transferring whatever is on them into the egg. And then that it's no longer affecting them. So there's all kinds of ways that we might go about something like removing ojo.
Yeah, it's funny because I always never associated the evil eye with Hispanic, Mexican witchcraft or anything, because you always hear about the Italian one, it's just me.
Mm-hmm.
And then Middle East, they all have jewelry with little evil eyes on them and stuff. But I don't know why I never realized. And I went, really? See, I learn things, even though they're, not world-shattering things, earth-shattering things, they are to me, because it's like, why didn't I know that, So that's it's really kind of interesting. Now, another thing that Brujeria has in common with so many other customs is working with the ancestors. Many of our traditions, and we've talked about this on my show 100 times already, but while we've spoken about setting up ancestor altars and working with them, and, talking about ancestors in general, I don't think anyone has ever mentioned some of the taboos and forbidden things in working with them that you mentioned in the book. I mean, I never even gave it a thought that there might be some taboos and stuff. So can we talk about that for a minute or two?
Well, absolutely. There's all kinds of things that you hear about, things that you can do and you can't do and all those things. One of the main taboos that we kind of talk about is, and one I get asked about a lot, is, can I put pictures of living people on the ancestors? And a lot of times that's really considered taboo, something that we don't really do, because it's believed that if we're kind of placing them in the land of the ancestors, that if we put their picture on the ancestor altar, that it will then bring that person a speedy death. At least that's the belief. There are certain things I'm willing to test. That's not necessarily one of them. So I just kind of go with that. Other times you'll hear things though like, oh, salt can go nowhere near the ancestor altar at all. If you're making them food, you can't put salt in it, blah, 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 these things like that. That is not something that I subscribe to, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, the ancestors deserve flavor. That is something that they deserve. And there's very much a difference between something like a ghost that is kind of stuck here in our plane and the ancestors who have crossed over and are on the other side. Right. When you're kind of in a crossed over state, you're not really susceptible to things like salt being around. Salt is not going to chase away your ancestors. If you have an ancestor, though, that's there and earthbound and has not crossed over, then, they'll be repelled by it. But in Mexican culture, during Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead festival, it's very common that when you build an ofrenda, or like one of the big ancestor altars there, to put a dish of salt on kind of the lower part of the ofrenda in order to keep away kind of restless ghosts or other spirits that might try to contaminate the area or take part in the offerings. It's just something that we often put on the ofrenda just to make sure that it stays clean so that the ancestors can take part in it, unburdened or uninterfered with. So in our culture, putting salt on the ancestor table is not something that should be avoided necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I was taught from a psychic that I knew years ago that if you want to get rid of a spirit, put some salt in the palm of your hands and lick it, and that spirit will disappear. And yeah, so I think this whole thing is pretty common across the board. And also, I swear we talked about this a couple of weeks ago on the show when we were talking about backwoods conjure, about keeping a live person's picture on the altar. And all of a sudden, the light bulb went over my head, and there was like a picture of me as a baby with my grandfather holding me on the ancestor altar. And as soon as the show was over, I plucked myself right off of there. It might not have been a horrible thing, but it's like, yeah, I'm the only living person on there. Get me out of here now, and I just replaced the picture with something else. And maybe that's a superstitious thing or whatever, but, it occurred to me, and I'm like, oh, God, there goes the light bulb. Get it off now. And then, you were also talking about the egg the cleansing, and we talked about that on that show a couple of weeks ago, too, about, rubbing you down with an egg and let the egg take all the bad stuff. So, I mean, there's so many similarities in things, but like I said, I had never considered anything taboo or forbidden when we're setting our ancestor altar up. And now, it was good to hear that something else that I learned. Hey, this is good. Never bad. So, all right. So here comes the age-old question. Can a non-Mexican work this kind of magic? Brujeria?
Yes. However, that's kind of line is yes. However, there's certain considerations to take in place, and the first one, of course, is why. Why are we doing this? Is it because it looks neat, or is there an actual connection to it, a reason, for being there? That's the first thing that we need to examine is the why. And then the second thing that we examine, in the first chapter of the book, I have a whole section that's a guide for people who are kind of approaching this work from outside of the community. And the second thing that I really want to kind of challenge people to do before they participate in this work is to, really examine how they interact with the Mexican people. And that's through their words, through their votes, through their personal biases, and through how they spend their money as well, is really important to kind of look at, how am I interacting with the Mexican community? Am I being a good ally? If not, what do I then intend to do to change that? Because when it comes to folk magic, we can't practice folk magic unless we know the folk. That's a quote from Queen Cordelia that I really love. And it's important that we remember that. So if we're just here to kind of throw the people under the bus and grab up all the spells, then we're automatically off to a bad start. So we need to examine our relationship with the people. Do we understand the people? Do we understand the culture? And if we don't, then we need to kind of educate ourselves on that. And then, of course, we run into this idea of cultural appropriation, which I am currently in a love-hate relationship with the dialogue surrounding cultural appropriation. Because on one hand, I'm very, very glad that we're finally having this conversation, that we're talking about it, that we're kind of pointing out that this is an issue that's been happening. I think that's very important. On the flip side, though, I think a lot of times people use policing cultural appropriation as a substitute for doing the actual personal work that they should be doing, which leads to things like my friends calling me and going, I'm so sad that I can never have a margarita again for the rest of my life because it belongs to Mexican culture. And I'm like, whoa. No, that's not how this works. You can still have a margarita.
Yeah, really.
Like, that is okay, right? We need to take a little bit of a step back.
And tacos are okay too, right? Yeah.
Right? Exactly.
Yeah.
We still have, as long as we're not wearing a sombrero and a funny fake mustache while we do it, we're in the clear.
There you go.
So in the book, I give kind of 3 main questions to ask yourself in order to avoid cultural appropriation. And the first one is, does this make me money? Right? So let's say, as an Indigenous person, let's talk about something like a dream catcher, right? So if you're a non-Indigenous person and you're having nightmares and you're like, you know what, I think I need to get a dream catcher, going out and buying one is okay, especially if you buy it from a Native American person. That's very important. And something that you should really seek to do if you're going to go purchase and use a dream catcher. Purchasing and using one for personal use is absolutely fine. If you want to make one yourself, that's okay as well. However, the moment that we make a bunch of them and start selling them on Etsy, then we have a problem, right? So it's things that shouldn't necessarily make you money. Then we also have, are you taking up space as the second question? So something that we face a lot as Native Americans is showing up to something like a sweat lodge and being the only Native American person there, including the person who's leading it. And so when we take up so much space in these marginalized communities, we often actually make these communities feel unwelcome in their own cultures, which is something that we want to avoid doing. And taking up space also extends to doing things like not writing books about it if you are not from that culture, or teaching classes on it. Those should be spaces that are left open for people from that culture. The final question is, does it erase culture? And this is one that a lot of people have a hard time kind of recognizing, because everything kind of seems very innocent. So, for instance, something that we're seeing a lot these days with something like like Santeria and working with the Orisha are very big right now. Everyone's, very into Oshun and all this stuff. And there's a whole process to beginning Santeria. And you go through divinations and initiations to find out, who your head spirits are, all this stuff, where you learn it all. But that's expensive, that takes work, that takes time, so people don't like to do that. So they just bend the rules or break them completely for efficiency's sake and jump straight to lighting candles to Yemaya or Oshun or Oya or any of these spirits, which then erases culture. It tells other people that we can completely ignore those sacred traditions and just skip to the fun part, which ends up being very damaging to these cultures that are trying to preserve their traditions. So if you're going to go have a margarita, you can ask yourself, is this margarita making me money? No, probably not. Is it taking up space in Mexican culture? Also probably not. And is it erasing culture? Also probably not. You're fine. Do the margarita.
Good way to put it, really, truly. All right. Yeah. So as time will go by very fast, it has. We were talking about, what a good book it is and all the good stuff in it. So why don't you tell everybody where they can find it? I'm assuming, in most bookstores, and also where people can find you.
Absolutely. So technically the book doesn't drop until May 1st. However, it's already out there. It's already on shelves in the bookstores. Go down to your favorite metaphysical store. Yes. It's probably already there, or if it's not, you can ask them to order it for you, and then that way you're supporting small business. I absolutely love that. It is available on Amazon. They're saying on the website that it's not being released until May 1st, but people started getting their copies about a week ago. So it's already out. It's already out there. It's going. So you can find it pretty much at this point anywhere where books are sold. It's also being sold on Amazon, of course, so it tends to be the easiest one for people, and it's good for my numbers, so that's great. You can find me on Instagram, mainly is where I hang out. I am at Oregon Wood Witch on Instagram. You can find me there, and from there you can stay up to date with everything that I'm doing. I teach classes. I offer spiritual coaching. I do spells for people, so you can hire me to do a spell on your behalf. I do all kinds of stuff. So you can find me on Instagram. That's my main hub where you can get in touch with me and get a reading or whatever it is that you need.
Perfect. Well, again, it's a fascinating book. I really liked it. It's full of so many more things that we didn't get a chance to talk about, but I really appreciate you for sharing what we could in the short time, and hopefully you'll come back at some point and we can explore even more.
That sounds lovely. Thank you for having me here, Marla.
Oh, my pleasure. And let's thank everybody for joining us tonight in the chat room, listening live, or the ones that are listening on podcast later on. And if you're listening to the podcast on the show's YouTube channel, here goes the spiel. Subscribe, like, comment, and click the bell so you'll be notified whenever new podcasts come up. So until next time, everybody, blessed be, and merry meet again. Good night.
Circle be open, but unbroken. May the peace of the goddess be ever in your heart. Merry meet and merry part, and merry meet again. Merry meet again. Merry meet again.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Stirring the Cauldron with Marla Brooks. Please join us again next week at the same time for another great guest and more cauldron stirring. Any rebroadcast or other use of this program without explicit permission is strictly prohibited.